Bonsoir tout le monde. I'd like to begin by thanking the premiers for joining me for today's First Minister meeting, and also for the work that they have been doing for Canada. Canadians have become more united than ever before, and they rightly expect their governments to work together to advance a positive, action-oriented agenda to build one Canadian economy, and that Canadian economy to be the strongest in the G7. Il nous faut une seule économie canadienne, pas 13. La guerre commerciale déclenchée par les États-Unis nous a démontré que les Canadiens et Canadiennes sont prêts à s'attaquer aux obstacles qui menacent notre économie. Reconnaissant l'impact sur les travailleurs et les entreprises, nous avons annoncé aujourd'hui de l'aide pour nos travailleurs et nos entreprises. So what we announced today, earlier today, in order to support Canadian workers, we will temporarily waive the one-week employment insurance waiting period. So in other words, if people are displaced because of the tariff situation, they immediately can receive unemployment insurance. To make it so that workers don't have to exhaust any severance pay before collecting EI, we will remove that restriction. We'll also make it easier to access EI, and I can explain the technicalities around that if you're interested, but trust me, that's what's going to happen. It's important. To support Canadian businesses, we will temporarily allow them to defer corporate income tax payments and GST and HST remittances. So this is a way to boost their liquidity. We'll also deploy a new financing facility, which the Minister of Finance, I'm going to blame him, has decided to call the Large Enterprise Economic and National Security Facility. And again, this will provide liquidity support. And we will also provide more funding for regional development agencies. These measures as a whole will help our workers, help keep our businesses running, and protect our economy during this phase of the trade war. Now, we briefed premiers on this. We had an exchange of views on the situation with the United States, the tariff measures announced by China. And then the meeting turned to its focus, which was nation building. And that is the focus of First Ministers. It is nation building. Because together we can give ourselves more than any foreign government can ever take away. We can more than offset the effects of any U.S. tariffs by eliminating internal trade barriers alone. Removing barriers to the free movement of workers and goods and services would increase the size of our economy. This is an updated figure by $250 billion. So that's the equivalent of more than $6,000 for every single Canadian. Il est grand temps de bâtir des choses que nous n'avons jamais imaginées à une vitesse que nous avons jamais vue. Il faut s'unir pour bâtir le pays le plus fort, le plus juste et le plus libre du monde. First Ministers agreed today, and again I thank them for this, we agreed today to develop a national trade and energy corridor strategy. Yeah, for transportation, for energy, for critical minerals, and digital connectivity. And so the agreement is to turn what has been a concept into a reality that will diversify and strengthen our economy. And to make that concrete, the federal government, my government, is acting now in several ways. Let me begin by saying that we are committing to remove all exemptions, all federal exemptions, under the Canada Free Trade Agreement. We're introducing a new First Mile Fund to provide capital to build transmission and transportation networks to link extraction sites to existing rail and road networks. In other words, if you think of a critical minerals project or something that's away from an existing network, linking them in can be decisive on the economics and whether they get built. We are creating a one-window approval process. We are committing to table legislation by the 1st of July for goods to travel across the country barrier-free or free of barriers, of federal barriers. So we're combing through all federal legislation for those barriers. We intend to, from a federal level, to have free trade by Canada Day. We are going to remove any labor mobility restrictions for federally regulated professions. We will eliminate federal duplicative requirements by recognizing provincial assessments for major projects. This is so-called mutual recognition, so one project, one review. And we will work with the provinces and other stakeholders, Indigenous groups, to identify projects of national significance and accelerate the time frame to build them. And I'm proud to highlight a few of the major projects that the federal government, again, to make these words real, what we've moved on today to advance. The Cedar LNG and LNG Canada in British Columbia. Investments in Port of Churchill in northern Manitoba. To ensure Indigenous participation, or to promote Indigenous participation, facilitate Indigenous participation, we are expanding the Indigenous Loan Guarantee Facility to $10 billion. That's doubling. And what this does is it unlocks capital for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis to invest in equity of projects, in other words, to become owners of, co-owners of projects, in order for those projects to be built quickly and sustainably. We will keep working with our provincial partners to build out national interest projects that cross interprovincial boundaries so they can be prioritized and accelerate. One project, one review, it's time to build. Now, some examples of potential future projects, and this is not an exhaustive list, but you look to the Ring of Fire in Ontario in partnership with Indigenous peoples. Ports like Grays Bay in Nunavut, which links down through the Northwest Territories and into Alberta, and the Le Port de Montréal. The Second Narrows in British Columbia, which frees up additional exports. And very importantly, action, not words, but action on carbon capture and storage. These projects would build on recent progress that we've made on high-speed rail between Quebec and Ontario, an integrated electricity system for Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. Nous avons une occasion unique de développer rapidement ces corridors afin qu'ils soient efficaces, résilients et tournés vers l'avenir. Our vision is one where goods, services, and workers can move seamlessly from coast to coast to coast, d'un océan à l'autre. By harmonizing regulations, by enhancing labor mobility, we can create that truly open and one Canadian market that Canadians are demanding. That will reduce costs for our businesses, it will increase affordability for our consumers, it will unlock new opportunities, higher paying jobs for Canadians. Je suis convaincu qu'en travaillant ensemble, nous pouvons développer et bâtir une économie canadienne plus interconnectée et plus résiliente. Because Canadians are strongest when we're united. Choisissons de bâtir un Canada fort. Merci beaucoup, and I'll be pleased to take your questions.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Merci, Mr. Premier ministre. Nous allons prendre une quinzaine de minutes de questions. We'll take about 50 minutes of question. First question, Global News.
Hi, Mr. Carney. Mackenzie Gray with Global News. You talked about nation building and energy corridors. Is the federal government willing to build an oil and gas pipeline similar to what Mr. Trudeau did with TMX?
Well, I think what the spirit of what we're doing as First Ministers and what we're doing as the federal government is creating a framework so that the private sector will be building these projects. And I think part of the reason, if I may, that the federal government with TMX became involved is in part because of uncertainty about the regulatory environment, the authorities and the permitting that was required. So from an action perspective, coming together with consensus, moving quickly on approvals, maintaining standards, but moving quickly on approvals, in other words, not duplicating approvals, we can create an environment where the taxpayers' money is not at risk, but private money is building not just pipelines in that case, but cross-border electricity interties, something we discussed at length as First Ministers, so that clean electricity is moving across borders. And then we're building out an energy grid across this country. En français, ce qui est important, c'est de créer une cadre de réglementation qui est claire, qui est simple, qui n'est plus duplicatif, comme était le cas quand le TMX a été bâti par le gouvernement fédéral. Et le fédéral devait le faire, selon moi, à cause d'incertitude, cette situation d'incertitude. Alors, avec des changements qui nous mettons en place à partir de maintenant au fédéral, on peut relier au secteur privé beaucoup plus que le fédéral. D'accord.
When you mentioned those nation-building projects, you talked about rail that's going to cost the federal government tens of billions. So just to clarify, your position is that your government would not build or spend federal tax dollars to build an oil and gas pipeline?
Well, the position is not black and white. So it's not only this, only that. So for example, with respect to the TGV, the high-speed rail, there is an overall cost estimate for that project. There will be some federal participation, capital participation, but there will also be private capital at risk. So it's not, that is a case of a partnership, and the details of that partnership are being worked out in the coming years. And I can assure you that I will be paying close attention to how that is developed so that it's the most effective financing framework. With respect to, and I'm going to speak in terms of energy, cross-border energy, of forms of energy, including critical metals and minerals, which are a form of energy just earlier stage. First and foremost, what we're looking to do is to provide, as I said a moment ago, the frameworks to provide greater certainty and duplication, create a sense of urgency that is required by the crisis. And sometimes, I actually didn't mention, but I'm going to mention again, we are in a crisis, not of our own making, but that is the case now. And we need to come together and focus on it, which is what First Ministers were doing today, and I salute them for it. And by doing this, the vast, vast, vast majority of investment dollars and risk is going to be borne by the private sector, and rewards, of course, by the private sector. But I'm not going to rule out any federal participation in any possibility down the road. I mean, it's possible, but the emphasis is on private construction. Thank you.
Good evening, Prime Minister Carney. Olivia Stefanovich, CBC News. You appeared to suggest yesterday that you're open to moving away from the federal government's emissions cap, while your environment minister said that the cap will remain in place. Can you explain what your approach will be to the emissions cap, and specifically how it will be determined and what will inform your decision?
Well, there's two things, or there's several things here. First, I'm a pragmatist, so I'm focused on, as the government is, on getting emissions down from the production and transportation of conventional oil and gas. Okay, that's good for the environment. It ultimately will be good for the competitiveness of those producers and the distribution of that. So that's the objective, is to get down. Now, there is a role for an emissions cap. And again, emissions cap, not a production cap, but an emissions cap. I know you didn't say it, but just to be clear, because some twist it. There is a role for an emissions cap within that. But what's required in order to get those emissions down, the emissions intensity down of the production that we can see growing, particularly if Canadian oil and gas is displacing American oil and gas that we're importing right now in eastern Canada. What's required is investment. Investment in carbon capture and storage technology, investment in reducing methane, fugitive methane, methane flame, other aspects, et cetera. What's required is investment. And what happened in, I can't remember where the room is, whether it was there or over there, somewhere around here where the room was, is, and what I was referring to earlier, what the federal government is doing, is putting in place the framework so that that investment is going to happen more quickly. So my focus and where I took my response the other day is around how are we going to make that investment happen. So the cap is there. The issue is getting the investments down. How are we going to get them down? I'm focused on that. We're making progress in unlocking that. We need to continue to work on it.
U.S. President Donald Trump claims that he totally changed you and your party's fortunes. Is he interfering in our election? And since he repeated the 51st state comment about Canada, does this mean that a meeting with Trump or a phone call is off the table?
Canadians are going to decide who their next government is going to be. I trust Canadians to make those decisions. We'll have, I'm sure, a robust election campaign, and Canadians will make the choice. No foreign leader is going to determine who's best. One of the factors is going to be, in my judgment, who is going to be best for Canada in the negotiations with the Americans, which will come, but they're, from my perspective, they're not going to come until we get the respect we deserve as a sovereign nation. By the way, this is not a high bar. This is not a high bar to say we will sit down as a sovereign nation and have this negotiation, but also that we will have a comprehensive discussion, not a discussion about one-off tariffs, the latest initiative, but a comprehensive discussion of the economic relationship and the security relationship, which is also in the interests of the United States. So the interference, I'll leave that to one side. The requirements for the negotiations are clear. We're ready. Last point I would make, which is the most important point, and I've said it before, but I'll keep repeating it. We can't control what's said in an Oval Office spray, I think it's called. Scrum, we would say. We can't control that. What we can control are the types of issues we talked about today as First Ministers and what's behind that. That investment, that building the Canadian economy, that will give us far more than we could lose from American trade actions. Now, of course, in the end, America is going to lose from American trade actions. And that's one of the reasons why I'm confident that there will be that discussion with the appropriate amount of respect and the breadth, and I'm ready for it anytime they're ready. Tout en français, c'est beaucoup de le faire. Je suis prêt et puis je serai les enjeux. Alors, pourriez-vous, OK. En ce qui concerne les commentaires de Monsieur le Président, c'est intéressant, mais c'est intéressant, mais absolument pas décisif pour notre élection. Les Canadiens, les Canadiennes vont décider le prochain gouvernement, qui est le prochain gouvernement de notre pays. Alors, c'est simple. Je suis absolument confiant de ça. Autre chose. Comme j'ai dit plusieurs fois, nous sommes dans une crise. Nous sommes dans une crise économique. Et il faut distinguer entre des choses qu'on peut contrôler et qu'on ne peut pas. On ne peut pas contrôler les commentaires de M. le Président ou les tweets ou les truths de M. le Président, tout cela, mais on peut contrôler et nous doit contrôler notre destin économique. Et la discussion qui vient d'arrêter, la discussion des premiers ministres concentrée sur les grands enjeux pour renforcer et d'augmenter notre économie.
Bonjour, M. Carney, Olivier Boissé de TVA. Vous avez nommé Mark Wiseman sur votre Conseil des relations Canada-États-Unis. Il est cofondateur de l'initiative du siècle qui a fait pression sur le gouvernement pour obtenir 100 millions de personnes au Canada d'ici 2100. On a vu les impacts des seuils élevés d'immigration sur les services, sur le logement, même sur la capacité d'intégration au Québec. Je me demande, dans le contexte, pourquoi on a besoin des conseils de cette personne-là, une personne qui a dit aussi que le Canada devait avoir 100 millions de personnes d'ici 2100, même si le Québec aboie.
OK. Merci pour votre question. M. Wiseman est un homme d'affaires, une personne d'affaires avec beaucoup d'expérience aux États-Unis et beaucoup d'expérience transfrontalière, beaucoup d'expérience en ce qui concerne l'investissement dans l'infrastructure, par exemple. L'infrastructure énergétique, l'infrastructure reliée à l'information artificielle, intelligence artificielle, tout cela. Toutes les choses qui s'intéressent le Conseil canado-américain. OK? Ça c'est pas une question d'immigration. On parle jamais là au ce sujet. Et c'est un sujet important, mais c'est pas un conseil qui s'intéresse à ça. Et première chose. Deuxième point. Je ne suis presque jamais, non, je suis jamais d'accord avec tous les avis de personnes, même dans cette salle. OK? C'est, follow-up.
Je dois vous relancer sur M. Legault qui nous disait qu'il voulait des ajustements sur les représailles, sur les comptes aux tarifs, parce qu'il y a des intrants qui affectaient beaucoup les entreprises québécoises. Qu'est-ce que vous lui avez répondu? Oui,
premièrement, il y a un processus de rémission, des rémissions en ce qui concerne des représailles. Et il y a un processus pour des sociétés québécoises ou sociétés d'Alberta. On a une discussion. J'ai eu une discussion avec le premier ministre Smith en ce qui concerne ça pour des sociétés albertaines, par exemple. Alors, il y a un processus et c'est une des... Alors, premier point, il y a un processus. Deuxième point, c'est une des raisons pour lesquelles on ne peut pas... Ça dépend, et c'était une question de Tonda la semaine dernière en Angleterre, je crois. On ne peut pas faire des repris dollar par dollar si les menaces américaines ont une grandeur, une ampleur extraordinaire. OK? Alors, il faut être ciblé. Il faut être ciblé afin d'avoir un impact maximum négatif aux États-Unis et un effet minimum, et bien sûr, négatif ici au Canada. Merci.
Bonjour, M. Carney. Raphaël Pirot du Journal de Montréal. Merci de répondre à nos questions. En une semaine, vous avez promis vous avez déjà éliminé une partie de la taxe sur le carbone. Vous avez promis d'annuler la hausse sur les gains en capital. Vous avez ouvert la porte au projet de pipeline. Et vous avez aussi promis d'annuler la TPS sur l'achat d'une première maison.
Ouais.
Ma question est simple. Pourquoi vous n'êtes pas présenté pour le Parti conservateur?
Il y a plusieurs raisons pour lesquelles. En même temps, j'ai proposé, j'ai commencé un processus afin d'avoir un marché sur le carbone, des crédits de carbone. Deuxièmement, quand j'ai réduit le TPS, je n'annule pas le fonds d'accélérateur des logements. OK? Monsieur Poilievre, il dit, OK, pas de TPS, pas d'accélérateur. Monsieur le maire de la ville de Québec, il m'a dit, il y a quelques semaines, ça c'est le meilleur programme. C'est un partenariat avec la ville et le fédéral. Madame le maire de Saskatoon m'a dit la même chose. Okay? Monsieur le maire d'Edmonton, la même chose. Le Parti libéral, nous créons des initiatives, des partenariats entre le gouvernement et le secteur privé afin d'avoir de meilleurs résultats pour les Canadiens et les Canadiens. Il y a plusieurs d'autres différences entre le Parti libéral et le Parti conservateur et il y a de plus entre moi et M. Poilievre, ça c'est sûr. The question was, well, I won't repeat the question if you don't mind. You do your own translation. I drew one distinction, which is that when I reduced the GST on housing for first-time homebuyers, I didn't pay for it by getting rid of the Housing Accelerator Fund. That's what Mr. Poilievre said when he did something similar. Because he doesn't understand the role of government in helping to create solutions in our economy. And now, the Housing Accelerator Fund, which works to help reduce development charges, works in partnership with cities to build, and it's one of many programs as part of our housing strategy that exists. And I will add to this, you will see more. You will see some extraordinary additional initiatives that will help us double the rate of housing in the coming weeks, proposed by the Liberal Party. You won't see them on the Conservative Party. The Conservative Party will say, well, they just cut taxes, cut regulation, everything will happen. 1,000 flowers will bloom. Well, okay, we know how that works. That is a fundamental difference, and it's a difference that's recognized, for example, by the mayor of Quebec, Quebec City, the mayor of Saskatoon, the mayor of Edmonton, I could go on. The mayor of Quebec, who, at least in my opinion, is an incredibly effective mayor, but is stupid, according to Mr. Poilievre.
Merci. Et
That's, by the way, is another reason why I wouldn't be a member of the Conservative Party, because that's the attitude that's taken to different levels of government. It's the attitude that's taken to First Nations, Indigenous people. I'm going to give you another example. Now you've got me warmed up, okay? You got me warmed up. You look at the situation, look at the difference between my visit to Nunavut and that of Mr. Poilievre. Poilievre goes, gives a press conference, flies in, flies out. Doesn't meet the premier who was there, doesn't meet the Indigenous representatives that are there, says he's going to build a base on the land there with no consultation, and he's going to pay for it by canceling foreign aid. Where did he get the idea to cancel foreign aid? Well, I think he did because that's what Doge just did, and that's where he gets his talking points. Difference is, I go there, of course I meet with the premier. Of course I talk to the premier many times in advance. I meet with the Indigenous groups, in partnership with them. It's economic development, it's security, it's partnership, it's built out. We don't cancel anything.
Monsieur Carney, vous êtes un économiste de formation. Le Canada a un des plus faibles taux de croissance de PIB par habitant dans les 10 dernières années. Selon vous, qu'est-ce qui explique ça et qu'est-ce que vous auriez fait différemment?
C'est une grande question, merci pour cette grande question, mais je veux commencer. C'est pas aussi facile que ça de dire, OK, une réponse. Si j'étais Pierre Poilievre, il faut réduire des impôts. C'est facile, hein? Et c'est fini. Non. C'est pas comme ça. Il faut changer des impôts. Mais ma réponse est ça. Cette question, c'est une des grandes raisons que je suis Premier ministre maintenant, afin de régler cette situation. Il y a plusieurs aspects, plusieurs initiatives qui sont nécessaires de régler cette situation, d'augmenter. C'est pas une situation, c'est la vie des Canadiens et des Canadiens, la pénurie de pouvoir d'achat de nos ménages, de Canadiennes, de Canadiens. Alors, c'est les raisons pour lesquelles on fait des efforts dans la salle des premiers ministres, des changements. Il faut investir, il faut j'arrête là. On peut avoir une plus grande conversation. On peut avoir une conférence de presse sur la productivité. Il n'y a personne ici, hein, mais peut-être sauf vous, monsieur. OK, merci.
We'll do just dernière question, last question with this.
OK.
Bonjour, M. Carney, Juliane Lapointe de Radio-Canada. Juste pour qu'on soit clair, est-ce que vous allez maintenir un plafond sur les émissions, oui ou non?
Oui. Oui. On va. on va le maintenir. Mais ce qui est absolument important, seulement d'avoir une réglementation, une loi, ce n'est pas suffisant de réduire les émissions. Les émissions, il faut agir, il faut d'action, il faut investir, il faut changer le cadre de réglementation. Et moi, je mets l'accent sur l'action. The emission cap, yes, keep the emission cap in place, but a regulation, a law, that doesn't reduce emissions. What I'm focused on is action in order to reduce those emissions. That requires partnerships. It requires a different framework, the types of things we were talking about in the room. Sorry, it's a big word, but it means that you've got to be able to get a project approved quickly. You have to be able to have co-investment in those projects. You have to have a clear framework for carbon pricing and others. All of that's required in order to help get those emissions down. And one of the projects, I firmly believe this, of national interest, national significance, is major investments in carbon capture and storage. We have the opportunity not just to get emissions down, but very importantly to create an entirely new industry that will serve Canadians well, but will create exports and jobs and opportunities for many decades.
Last follow-up.
Et selon vous, c'est quoi le tracé idéal pour un pipeline au Canada? Il commence où? Il finit où?
Je vis dans le monde, il n'y a pas d'idéal. Il y a plusieurs options. Comment répondre? Alors, ça vaut mieux d'avoir une situation ou une pipeline, un oléoduc, qui déplace des importations des États-Unis, en effet. OK, par exemple, maintenant, jour par jour, au Québec, il y a à peu près 350 000 barils d'huile par jour, la consommation. Et c'est plus de 70% viennent des États-Unis. Ce n'est pas une bonne idée. Pas une bonne idée du tout pour nous. Alors, il y a une occasion, une opportunité d'avoir un oléoduc là. Mais il faut avoir l'acceptance sociale. Il faut avoir un partenariat avec les peuples autochtones en même temps. Alors, ce n'est pas une question pour moi de dire, OK, il y a une ligne sur la carte du Canada. OK, on y va. Ça, c'est l'approche de M. Poilievre.